Good day, everyone. I have a few videos that I'm working on, but I just wanted to bring this up. A friend of mine, a couple friends of mine actually, are going through this, and I absolutely want to commend them and bring light to this situation. When people grow up or are in for a extended period of time, a toxic environment, they tend to adapt to that toxic environment despite most of their defense mechanisms or their interactions being in itself toxic and not realizing that the world doesn't work that way. So I just want to give a couple of examples of this and hopefully, help some people out. And again, commend those who are going through it themselves. I know of someone who has gone through a situation where their family, according to their family, whoever is the loudest wins the argument. So everybody either is trying to be the loudest or trying to make life the most difficult for others who don't agree with their stance. Once you get out of these situations and you have time to reflect and look around and look at what like normalcy is, you realize that that's not how the world works. And all of the things that you've been doing to be able to function in that backwards toxic environment, those abilities and that you have honed over those years mean nothing now. So when dealing with arguments or disagreements or anything like that, most of the time people come up with facts or opinions and support those things with more facts or opinions or even anecdotes. Then the other person should understand that, and if they have a counterpoint, be able to express that counterpoint. You might not always be right, you might not always be wrong. You both could be right, you both could be wrong. Who knows? But if you are thriving in an environment where the loudest wins, then you're going to hone your voice and your approach to be the loudest. Now, when you get out of that environment and you try to do that somewhere else, it is not acceptable. And it takes a lot of people a lot of time to realize that if they're in the right mind space to actually self assess. There are some people out there that still do this, walking around in the real world all the time and don't realize that people just can't stand them because why even have a conversation with someone who is constantly yelling their points? I don't want to. There's another friend that has gotten out of the toxicity. It's actually hurtful sometimes. There's a lot of pain that goes through. So this person is realizing that the things that happened throughout life, childhood into adulthood, within that toxic place, when they leave that toxic place and have their own environment, create their own environment in which they want to live more peacefully, that they realize all of that stuff was hurtful, harmful, and also just the wrong way of going about having interpersonal relationships or even finances or anything. And it's difficult to go through because the thing that you thought was truthful, the thing that you thought was like a given in life, is now wrong. So now you have to come up with other strategies for life other than what you had to do to exist in this toxic environment. So if you're living in an environment with pollution in the air and you have to do so many things to counteract that pollution in the air, I'm talking about like smog, and then you go to a place like the top of a mountain, your lungs can't take it. Your lungs are like, oh my God, what is this? I don't know what to do. You can actually take the gas mask off and breathe. That's how things are supposed to be. That is the natural order of things. But once you get out of that, that seems toxic. My own example, one of the many examples that I have, is when I was young, there was a sufficient amount of sex talk around me. I made a correlation between sex and love. Sex equals love through this correlation. So if people were having a problem in their relationship, they would not have sex. Having no sex means that there's a problem, and having sex means there isn't a problem. And through that reinforcement, I went into my relationships thinking sex equals love. So if we're not having sex, we're not in love. You don't love me, or I don't love you. As I grew up, I believe that intimacy in a relationship is very important. That doesn't mean that sex equals love. And that doesn't mean that lack of sex equals lack of love. So I had to train my brain to not think this way. So imagine that you grew up in a household or an environment, a broader environment, in which there were no spoons and you ate soups with a fork. And in order to eat soups with a fork, these soups had to be hearty and thick so that most of it would be scooped up in a fork like a stew. And then you grow up and you don't buy spoons because why need them? There's no point in having spoons. Well, eventually, when you get out of that environment and you're taught about spoons and their various uses and how it makes certain things much easier, then you go and you buy spoons and you can adjust the way that you make soups and you make thinner soups and you don't have to worry about forks because there are spoons. Now, this is what happens when you get out of a toxic environment thriving on dysfunction and you realize there are spoons in the world and you realize that spoons are effective for certain things. If you go back to that environment and try to explain to people that they should be using spoons or that spoons have a beneficial effect, the people in those environments will shun you, will call you a heretic, will throw you out, will make you the black sheep, will discredit anything that you say. And this is the second part of why it's so hard. Because you're bringing in to their environment, to their truth, something that discredits their truth. That means that they have to reassess everything in their toxic environment or in the way that they do things because maybe everything that they're doing is wrong. And by doing so, their entire reality gets crushed over a spoon. So instead of doing that, instead of self-assessing, instead of realizing, oh, I've been living the last 50, 60 years with no spoons, let me introduce spoons and see if that makes my life easier, they're going to tightly hold on to the idea that spoons are awful, spoons are of the devil, only whores use spoons. Whatever they have to do to discredit the spoon as well as you, because you got out of that backwards, tipsy, topsy, toxic environment so that you can experience what really is right and wrong, what really is moral, what really is more efficient, how to actually communicate without yelling, how to have relationships that aren't based on sex equals love. That when you come back to that environment, they have to hold on to themselves so tightly and their beliefs so tightly because if you break those beliefs, then what do they have? They have to then admit that everything they've been doing up to that point is backwards or non-efficient or stupid or not how the world fucking works. So when you present them with evidence contrary to their beliefs, that adaptation you're showing them is no longer valid or needed, their whole world would be falling apart. That's why most people in an environment in which they had to adapt to live in that environment, when you leave that environment, you're the ostracized one because the things that you've learned threatens their way of life and their way of thinking. And most people don't want to think that they're wrong. So by threatening the way of their thinking and their belief system, everything will come crashing down. And most people don't want to deal with that. So I want to commend those people who I know and people who I don't know who are going through this. When you leave an environment and are surprised that the way that you do things doesn't have to be done, and that life is simpler, or that there are other ways to do things that are more socially accepted, or that spoons exist and they're not the devil, or they're not for whores, or whatever, then you start realizing what exactly is going on. It's almost like a dictatorship. They have to hold on to a lie. And the person who escapes that lie is a threat to the entire system, because that system is just not one thing, it's a multitude of things. For example, the loudest person wins the argument. That's based on wanting so badly to be right, even when they're wrong. They're going to continue to hold on to their wrong belief and yell at you. And then when you back down, they have that power. When you leave and come back and say, why are you yelling? You know, there's ways to communicate that you don't have to yell for. They will go nuts. Things will blow up. It'll be nuclear. And it's not because what you're saying is wrong, it's because what you're saying threatens their entire foundation of what they've lived and how they've adapted to that environment, and destroys their entire being as a person. Now, getting out of that, you have to break down your own foundations when you see evidence of other things being valid and probably easier and more efficient. And when that happens, you have to break down some things yourself. And breaking down a wall is not easy. I gotta say, I commend those people who recognize those things and have gotten out of their toxicity and gotten to the top of the mountain and coughed through the clean air until their lungs got used to what is natural. Open your mind and say to yourself, maybe there are things that I've grown up with that aren't necessarily normal. And at some point, we have to grow up and see things for what they are and learn from other people, learn from ourselves, learn from our experiences, try to figure out why things have been working or haven't been working for us. There's a lot of self-assessment. You assess yourself, but you also have to assess your environment around you and ask, why is it that certain things are not working? And maybe the way that you were taught them or you witnessed them as a child isn't really the way that life actually works. So one more time, those people who are doing what I'm talking about right now have gotten out of a bad, toxic, backwards, inefficient environment, that have learned to adapt to live in that environment. You don't have to. Life can be much easier. Get on that mountain, breathe that air. Your body might reject it for a little bit, but after a while, you go back to that smog and you're like, how did I ever live in this? Take care, people.